Okay, next I need to stitch on the shoulder reinforcement pieces. If you remember, these are the roughly 10 by 5, I think is the dimensions in the instructions. These are the pieces that reinforce the shoulder and also act as a gusset here at the neck opening. And so what I've done on both sides is I've pinned the raw edge of the shoulder reinforcement piece at the raw edge of the sleeve opening, that 11-inch sleeve opening that's here. And I've pinned along the side until I get to a point here at the shoulder seam itself. And so you can see the corner of the reinforcement piece is now at the edge of the neck opening here. And I've done the same thing on both sides. And what that gets you, if you can see it here on the camera, is a neck opening there. It's not round, it's a little awkwardly square, as you can see, but that gives you a neck opening. Now I put this on a few minutes ago, and this actually does match up pretty well with my neck size. If your neck size is larger, then one thing that I think you can do is just come in and shorten, cut off incremental small pieces here until you sort of lengthen or shorten the length of the shoulder pieces, which will then by default open up the neck a little bit more. So the next thing to do is to backstitch these pieces in place, and that can get a little tricky because you want to make sure that these shoulder reinforcement pieces lay flat, and as you stitch, if you're not careful, you can kind of pull them up and then try to fight getting it to lay flat again, or even worse, having to go out and cut out what you did. So use a lot of pins. That's the best advice I have for you. So I'm going to get these back stitched in place, and then we'll pick up again on the inside of the garment, and I can show you a really cool stitch called the herringbone stitch. And that herringbone stitch is going to help the seam on the inside of the garment lay flat and add a little more reinforcement to the piece. Right, the herringbone stitch that I did on the shoulder seams, really the thread match was so good for the material, it really didn't show up very well. So I wanted to take a few seconds to show you kind of what the herringbone stitch is, and more importantly, how to do it. It's a really, really cool stitch. It's probably one of the more fun ones actually to sew, because you can really work with geometry there, and it's very pleasing to the eye, in my opinion, when it's done. In order to show you, I've got just a short section of thicker contrasting color thread. Now the herringbone stitch is like the zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. It's designed to take two raw edges and sort of seal them off so that they become what's called edge stable. And the way you hand sew the herringbone stitch is I'm going to work from top to bottom, but my stitches are actually going to go from bottom to top. So let me show you what I mean here. We're going to start here on that side of the fabric, and now I'm going to come across to the other side of the fabric, and I'm going to go from bottom to top, and that's going to create a sort of diagonal line there. Now what I'm going to do is come back across it like so and start the whole thing over again. Right? So as I pull it tight, you'll see a little X. Now I'm going to go to the opposite side and do the same thing again. Now, one thing that I noticed when I first started doing these is I want to make sure that my thread stays to the outside of this stitch. And sometimes that becomes a little challenging when, now this little thing right here is actually from a prior attempt at showing. Let me get that out of the way. Keeping the needle and thread to the outside of the stitch. Sometimes what will happen is the needle and thread will want to get to the inside of that herringbone stitch, and I'll show you what I mean here in just a second. But you can see again how that herringbone stitch is coming into play. Now, The mistake that I have made several times is if my thread somehow winds up here on the outside and now my needle is on the inside of the stitch, and that will start to affect the overall appearance of it, and it's just not the way it's done. So make sure you keep that needle to the outside of the stitch as you go. And this is the 18th century hand sewing stitch for making an edge flat and edge stable. All right, an additional mistake that I've noticed this morning in setting the sleeves that I can correct relatively easily, it's just kind of a setback a little bit, that's all. Because I inadvertently narrowed that shoulder seam a little bit and didn't account for that shoulder seam and this 11-inch sleeve opening that's right here, right? What I've got to do now is take the stitching of the body out a little bit more and bring it down roughly an inch. And so that's what I'm going to do next. I'll be bringing this down roughly an inch to account for the seam at the top, to just give me a little more room for setting the sleeve. What I don't want to do is try to jam the entire sleeve into too small of an opening, because you'll notice that in your armpit and you'll notice that with odd pulling. I think 18th century shirts, because they're square and rectangle patterns, I think they tend to pull in weird places compared to modern shirts anyway, and I don't want to exacerbate that by trying to cram this large sleeve into a smaller opening that I need to. So I'm going to take a few stitches of that body seam out as it comes up to the armpit, about an inch, re-secure that, and that'll just give me a little bit more room. So again, another lesson learned here on making a shirt, where there's no such thing as a free lunch, and what you give up on one side, you will have to try to regain on another. Setting the sleeve is what we're going to do next. So I've got the opening here, I've got the body of the shirt turned inside out, and I have the sleeve and the sleeve itself also turned inside out. So one of the things that I like to do first is find my little pin here that marks the center line of the top, and I like to find center line on the top of the sleeve, which is right here. And I am going to come in and match those two up. And what I'm doing is simply matching those seams up here, and then I'm going to actually just use this pin right here to pin that first location into place. And that first pin is going to also set my seam allowance, which I am leaving a little bit narrower than normal, and because I'm not sewing it yet, we can see how that works out once we start trying the sleeve on. Now the most important thing for the rest of this, match up the edges and then match up that seam allowance so the pinning is straight all around the opening. Now, while I do this, I want to talk just a minute about when you get to this particular component, I think you're going to be in this sort of mental state, if you're like me, where you can see the end in sight, like it's really starting to take shape, but you are also at the point where you are probably going to have to do this a few times to get everything just right, and that's per sleeve, and then once you get both sleeves set. So don't look at, I want to encourage you and myself while I'm saying this, don't look at having to redo it several times as you know, some sort of indication of your lack of ability, look at it as taking the time to get it done right the first time so that you don't make mistakes. I find myself as kind of a perfectionist, especially with authenticity, as much as I can be, stuck in this loop between that has to be good enough versus no one's going to see it, right? And that's kind of where I am with part of this. The garment itself will turn out the same way. For very few original garments that I've looked at in the past, or at least through exhibits in museums, I have also seen imperfections, right? So mistakes are a part of all of this, and as long as the garment looks appropriate in the end, then I will accept some of those minor mistakes and drive on. So I'm going to finish pinning this thing around, and then we'll pick up again and see what it looks like. All right, I have the sleeve now pinned into place for the first and maybe the only time. We shall find out. So you're looking at the underarm gusset there, and then coming around the sleeve itself to the top, and you can see the gathers. Now remember, this is inside out. You can see the gathers there, and it fit in very well. So let's turn it inside out. Now, as I mentioned before, using this method of setting your sleeves when you try it on, yes, you're probably going to get poked by pins. And the other thing that can happen is that you can also shed some of these straight pins accidentally on the floor. So be looking for them, pets, kids, spouses, whatever, yourself. You don't want to step on these things. So if you lose one, make sure you pick it up or you keep going. I learned that the hard way. All right, let's turn this inside out now and kind of see how everything sets. Okay, gently pulling. All right, now we are right side out. There are a couple little places that need to be pinned in place again. So let me do that for a second, just to make sure that I am getting a good, honest, and real assessment of how the final seam would look. Okay, so here we have shoulder seam, or shoulder reinforcement piece. We have the gathers here along the sleeve, and you can see they look a little wavy right now. It's in part because of the pinning rather than the stitching. The pins aren't going to give. And then coming down to the underarm gusset, it looks like we don't have a lot of pulling outside of what normally happens here right in the center of the gusset. I'm also at the end going to go back, and all these little seam convergences here that tend to have a lot of stress put on them just from raising your arms, just general movement. I actually go back at the end and I will bar tack all of those, and I will show you the bar tack stitch when it's appropriate. And that's just an extra little piece of reinforcement to where if this were to ever break for some reason, the seam itself, it would have to get through that bar tack before it got to the main body seam. All right, so I'm gonna try this bad boy on, and I gotta refix the camera to do it so you can see what I have accomplished. Okay, I've got the sleeve that we just pinned in place on camera there. I was able to get the second sleeve also pinned into place. So let's try this thing on here. I'm gonna do it for the first time on camera. I will try not to scream when one of these little pins pokes me in the underarm or the back of the arm where it's exceptionally sensitive. What I want to test for right now though, and I'm very gingerly putting this thing on so don't pull anything out, don't drop any of those pins that I got to go look for later. I want to check for a couple of things, right? I want to check to make sure the sleeve length is equal, and I want to check to make sure that the seams themselves where the sleeves meet the body look roughly equal. Now some of this will be covered eventually by the cape, so but as that perfectionist that I mentioned before, I want to make sure I get it as right as possible. I don't want to have a garment that I look at and remember all the mistakes that I made. I want to try to get one that is as correct as possible, while also being graceful to myself and recognizing where I could do better next time. So, all right, here we go. Sleeve length looks the same there, right? So almost perfect, which is great. They pull up just a hair, but that's okay. I mean, that's not a big deal. When I pull my arms up, they are going to pull back just a little bit. Kind of thing I think is normal. So as long as this garment doesn't shrink, as long as I do my part, take care of it, only cold water, only air drying, maybe not even in the direct sunlight, avoid heat, then this should be a garment, if I get my stitching correct, that will last a good long time. Okay, so I tried to set the sleeve on camera and it just didn't work out all that well. It was too much going on, and it was too difficult for me to film. So I'm going to do it in miniature to show you how I actually wound up setting the sleeve. I think in one of the prior explanations I'd mentioned when I turned the shirt inside out and pinned the sleeves together, wrong side out, I was just going to back stitch the whole thing and then flat fell the raw edge. Here's what I actually did, and it's more what the directions say to do, and it made more sense to me as I went on. So this little guy right here is going to represent the body of the shirt in miniature. And what you want to do is take, and I'm going to fold it in half so it looks more like the body here. And you want to baste back or to the inside roughly a ½ inch of that sleeve opening. So now what you get is a finished edge along the sleeve opening. Then I'm going to take the sleeve as represented by this little guy here, and you actually inset that into the opening, and you're left with this with this good covered edge here, a good stable edge. And all I did was went in and whip stitched all the way around from the outside to catch the gathers that would normally be here, and of course there'd be a gusset underneath here. And then I went back inside the shirt and flat felled the raw edge to the inside, which would look something like that right there. I went ahead and flat felled this back to the body of the shirt just to catch that edge and make it a little more stable. And I found that to be absolutely the easiest way I have ever set a sleeve into a shirt. And it was a little bit of a eureka moment for me. It's probably the way other people have been doing it for a long time, but it just clicked with me. So I hope that made sense for you in terms of setting the sleeves, making it easy. Once they're pinned in place and you know it fits, then nothing left to do but sew it up.